Okay, then, welcome everyone. Welcome once again to my lengthy lecture series on the history of video games. Although, with this and the last several lectures, we've been discussing the history of games before video games. And we are kind of getting close to the end of that. There should be, aside from tonight, there should be two more lectures as well as one more for a review on top of that. And then we'll finally be getting onto the video game portion of this. Finally, I know, right? Um, but yeah, tonight, last time we discussed the history of TV game shows. Well, really, game shows in general. And tonight we're going to be discussing the history of automobile racing. Hold on, let me switch over to the slideshow. And, hold on. Okay, cool. So you may be wondering, why am I covering automobile racing in such detail? Well, originally this wasn't the plan. Originally, I was going to simply include like a slide or two in my history of modern sports and discuss it very briefly there. But then I kind of got to thinking, and I realized that automobile racing, probably more so than any sport, than any other sport, has had a massive influence on video games to the point where there's literally an entire genre about it. And everything from Gran Turismo, Forza, Mario Kart, what have you, all of these games are directly based off of this one sport. And so I felt it was kind of necessary to go into more detail. And of course, that kind of led me to a bit of a research rabbit hole of sorts. Now, we've discussed very briefly kind of earlier forms of racing that existed. We've discussed some foot racing in terms of things like marathon and stuff like that. Not to mention, of course, foot racing has probably existed since as far as humans could walk. Um, Not to mention, we've discussed things like horse racing and chariot racing, and of course, humans have found ways to race all kinds of different things. There have been camel races, dog races, um, hot air balloon races. Yeah. So honestly, the thing boat races, of course, like odds are good if it can move. Humans at some point or another have tried to race it, and so it was probably really only inevitable that eventually automobile racing would come to be a thing. And as we'll see, it actually emerged very quickly after the first automobiles kind of hit the scene. So, as far as the origin of the car, of the automobile, the idea for automated carriages had kind of been toyed around with in the decades prior, though the first practical automobile which utilized internal combustion engine was invented in the 1880s. Before that, they actually tried a wide variety of different fuel sources, including there were some steam powered cars, which were very impractical because they had to have these massive boilers on them. But needless to say, almost immediately after the automobile came out, people began racing them. Though the cars from this time were very slow by today's standards and very unreliable. It was the sort of thing where even under ideal conditions, these things would break down all the time. Also, things weren't nearly as standardized as they are today. You can kind of see this from the picture, where, for example, even things like the steering wheel wasn't something that all cars had. Some of them had things like yokes or sort of steering dials or things like that. Now, eventually, people did start racing them, and I believe that the first races were largely sort of amateurish, like they kind of just enthusiasts trying to see who could reach places the first. But it wasn't long before the first organized race was created, which was held in 1894 between Paris and Rouen, France. That's a distance of only about 50 miles or 80 kilometers if you're in Europe. And the average speed was only about 10 miles per hour. So, needless to say, they weren't going very quickly. The next year, there was another race that was held between Paris and Bordeaux and back, and it was 731 miles, which was quite a bit further than the previous one. And get this, they managed to achieve an average speed of a whopping, mind blowing 15 miles per hour. I know, right? Is it even possible for cars to get any faster? So yeah, at around this time, we kind of start to see sort of a professionalization. Um, no longer is it just amateurs, competing with each other, but we start to get sort of a more corporate structure. We start to get, sponsors and kind of more official rules and sort of greater organization. Now, in 1894, the Automobile Club de France would be established that would create rules for racing that became standard throughout much of the European continent. Um, and during the 1890s, a number of town to town races would be held in both Europe and the United States. And again, especially in places like Italy and France, they really seem to have taken off there. Bear in mind, another thing is that most of the people who owned automobiles at this time would have been fairly wealthy. This was before Henry Ford created his Model T, so cars were very expensive, and they were sort of considered to be more like novelties for the rich, to the point where some people were actually very skeptical about whether or not cars would ever be able to sort of truly replace the horse and wagon. Um, Now, competition was heavily driven by the rivalry between different car manufacturers. And sort of the way it works is that these companies would sort of compete with each other for sort of prestige, to sort of show that we have the best cars, the fastest cars, the most reliable, so on and so forth. And and so to sort of prove it, the cars that were used in these early races, up until sort of the early 19 teens, tended to be essentially production models, although they were often sort of the prototypes of whatever next year's model was going to be. Not to mention, of course, this was a good way to kind of sort of field test a lot of these cars and kind of work any of the kinks out that needed to be worked out. Now, in 1894, the first closed circuit racetrack was created called the Course de Périgueux. God, I'm probably mangling that, but hopefully I got it okay. Several years of French classes completely down the drain. What can you do? But the thing is that by the turn of the century, automobile technology had improved by leaps and bounds to the point where cars could reach about 50 miles per hour consistently. And as a result, though, it became increasingly obvious that racing on public roads was both inefficient and dangerous. And as such, road races would disappear almost entirely. Now, of course, there were exceptions, and of course, there are illegal street races that still go on even today. But for the most part, they were race car driving was moved to kind of more specialized tracks. And what you got to understand about sort of road conditions at the time and why this was kind of necessary is, for one thing, most roads at the time weren't paved, and that's because, of course, they were built with horses in mind. So, why would you need the roads to be paved? That would be kind of just a waste of money, of time and money. On top of that, most cars at the time did not have shock absorbers. So, needless to say, if you were trying to race from one place to another, it was going to be a very bumpy ride. On top of that, because these roads were made out of dirt, it meant that when you drove on them, it kicked up a lot of dust. And this was a problem because cars back then didn't have front windshields. You can very much see it in some of these various pictures that I've been showing you. And as a result, it means that flies are going to get in your face, that dust is going to get in your face, especially if you're driving behind somebody else. You're going to be eating a face full of dust. Like the phrase "eat my dust" was very literal back then. um, and that's why you often, if you look at a lot of sort of motorist enthusiast pictures from that time, you'll see them wearing goggles, and that's because they needed that to protect their eyes. Otherwise, and sometimes they would even do stuff like wear scarves around their faces and stuff so that they wouldn't breathe in all that dust, which I imagine was not good for them. Not to mention, this was also a time when it was very common for livestock to kind of just wander onto the road because at the time there things like guardrails weren't in place because why would you need them? If you were riding a horse down the road, the horse would be smart enough to avoid any livestock that got in the way. And of course, this was a time when people were a lot more rural, when there were a lot more farms. So it wasn't uncommon for farmers to just let their animals graze wherever, and they just wander into the road. Um, and on top of that, also this was a time when people just commonly walked in the road themselves. And that actually led to a lot of issues with early automobile sort of infrastructure, where originally a lot of like towns and cities kind of tried to ban the driving automobiles within them because they were seen as dangerous, because people would get run over. What do you expect? There were no traffic laws at the time, so a car was considered to be very dangerous. And again, unlike a horse, there's no brain attached to it, at least not directly. So it was entirely possible that a person could just accidentally run somebody over. And of course, this was solved because a number of car manufacturers basically created a sort of they created like a marketing sort of publicity thing where they basically made it look like anyone who walked in the road was an idiot, and that's why we have the term jaywalker. Jaywalker being sort of jay being kind of a term for like an inbred sort of dirty hillbilly. Basically, the idea is that they tried to portray anyone who walked in the road as being an idiot, who deserved to get run over. Um, but yeah, as you can see, driving in roads back in the late 1800s and early 1900s was incredibly dangerous for a wide variety of reasons and just very inconvenient. So yeah, it was needless to say kind of a gimme that it would eventually sort of transition to more specialized tracks. Nice. It looks like we have another viewer. Again, anyone who wants to chime in the chat, feel free. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. So, people were constantly trying to push to see what the limits of these devices were. And in 1903, the first sanctioned time trials were held in Ormond Beach, Florida, giving it the nickname the birthplace of speed. Time trials are about seeing how fast a car can travel a given distance. Um, Generally, for these sorts of competitions, you want sort of very flat, very sort of even terrain. So things like beaches and salt flats were ultimately ideal for that sort of thing. The point where even now, I think like whenever they try to beat the land speed record, they usually do it in the salt flats of Utah generally. It had also served as kind of a convenient place for car manufacturers to, again, test out their various vehicles. Daytona Beach would, of course, end up being used for something similar, and that would eventually lead to the famous Daytona racetrack. You know, and of course, over the year, countless land speed records would be set. The current record is 763 miles per hour, which was set by Andy Green in 1997, which I'm actually surprised that it hasn't been beaten since then. Uh, that actually was a bit of a shock to me, but maybe one day. Although I believe that the cars that they use to set land speed records are more akin to rockets than they are to automobiles, like rockets on wheels, essentially. And I think like part of the problem is that after a while, like if you start getting fast enough in those sorts of vehicles, you eventually just start lifting off the ground. Actually staying attached to the ground kind of becomes difficult. Okay. So the first truly international racing competition was held in 1900 with the Gordon Bennett Cup, which lasted until 1905. Then the following year would see the first French Grand Prix. It is one of the longest running racing competitions in the world and would eventually and it's seen its most recent event occurring as recently as 2022. That same year would see the first speedway built specifically for auto racing at Brooklands, England. Then in 1909, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was created, with the first Indianapolis 500 competition occurring 2 years later in 1911, and it's been held annually to this day. And I believe that when the Indianapolis 500 was first paved, it was actually paved with bricks rather than concrete. So, or asphalt rather. So, I have to wonder how that acts as a surface compared to what we're used to. But as you can kind of see by these pictures here, by this time racers had begun using more specialized race cars instead of consumer models. Um, well, it's um, and that's kind of a trend that will definitely continue in the future, especially after the First World War. Now, one form of racing that emerged in the early 1900s was endurance racing. It's generally held anywhere between 3 to 24 hours, and the winner is the racer that traveled the furthest distance within a given time. It's intended as a test of the durability of cars and the stamina of the driver. I can imagine that having to drive in a race for 24 hours straight must be quite taxing. The first endurance race was held in 1900 in Italy, but the first 24-hour race was held at Driving Park at Columbus, Ohio in 1905. Now, of course, the most famous endurance race that we still have today is the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which was first held in 1923 and is still going. Now, believe it or not, Prohibition actually played a major part in the development of automobile racing. Now, for those of you who don't know or maybe live outside of the United States, during the 1920s there was a prohibition against the sale and production of any alcohol and spirits within the United States. This was initially started by a constitutional amendment, and long story short, it ended up being a colossal failure, and it led to a sharp rise in organized crime as as people still wanted their alcohol and were willing to resort to less than legal means to gain it. And this, of course, resulted in a boom of bootlegging and moonshining operations. Bootlegging being the process in which alcohol is smuggled into the country. It's so named because supposedly these bootleggers would carry illegal alcohol within the legs of their boots, and moonshining being when they would make basically would usually in places sort of deep in the woods would make illegal alcohol, and it's called moonshining because supposedly they did it by the light of the moon. And obviously, in order to, the U.S. is a big place, so in order to get this alcohol from either where the moonshining is or from the border, you needed to transport it, and of course, this would sometimes result in chases with the police. You know, the police would try to would figure out what car the criminals were driving in and would try to chase them down. And as a result, criminals began modifying their cars to make them faster to outrun the police. Now, these modifications had to be discreet so that they wouldn't draw attention to themselves. You know, like if you go to, I don't know, the local library or whatever, and you park and your car is obviously heavily modified, it's going to draw some suspicion. You know, obviously, why would you modify a car that heavily unless you're doing something illegal with it? And generally, these modifications were done with essentially consumer grade, sort of off the shelf components, but just sort of done in sort of very creative ways. And eventually, these moonshine runners started to get together and compete with one another in their own races. And by the 1930s, such events became increasingly organized and continued even after the end of Prohibition. See how many viewers? Okay. And this is basically the birth of what's called stock car racing. And a stock car because it's using a stock car. It's like an actual sort of consumer grade car, although of course modified. And in 1948, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, or NASCAR, was founded. The rule stated that cars had to be constructed from parts that were available to the public through automotive dealers. Now, the sport would gain a great deal of popularity throughout the U.S., especially in the South. It's very popular down here, and it sort of has developed its own sort of culture and fandom surrounding it, with NASCAR drivers becoming sort of celebrities and stuff. And though it hasn't really managed to catch on all that much outside of the U.S., as far as I know, at least. Now, early stock car racing would kind of branch off in a couple different ways. First is, of course, through to things like NASCAR, but another way that it kind of evolved in a different direction was that it would create hot rod racing. Hot rods were originally heavily modified stock cars, but eventually they became highly specialized. Racing originally took place in places like the Southern California desert, and this eventually evolved into drag racing. Drag racing involves two cars racing in a straight line to try and reach the finish line first. Well, at least the story goes that it started in the 1940s with World War II veterans sort of after the war making use of decommissioned air bases and landing strips as racetracks. Um, and of course, this eventually became more organized, and it led to the creation of the National Hot Rod Association, or NHA, in 1951. Now, of course, there's also Formula One racing, which is very big in a lot of places in the world, especially in Europe. Um, now, of course, by this point, racing had kind of it had become sort of stratified with different sort of like leagues and different what's the word I'm looking for a different sort of strata of racing. And before World War II, the organizations responsible for international racing championships were the World Manufacturers Championship in which operated between 1925 and 1930, and then immediately after that there was the European Drivers' Championship, which continued until 1939, and 1939 being the year because obviously what happened that year, World War II happened, and such events were put on hold during the war. You couldn't exactly send international drivers all over the place when people were blowing each other up. But in 1946, Formula One was created by the Federation International Automobile, with the first World Championship being held in 1950. And since then, F1 racing has been seen as the highest class of racing for open wheel single driver racing competition in the world. Now, of course, there are sort of lower classifications like F2 and F3, but they don't get nearly as much publicity as F1. F1 is has never really caught on here in the U.S., at least not all that much, at least not what that I'm aware of. But it is very popular in much of the world. Is again, especially in Europe. They love F1 racing over there. Next up is kart racing. Now, racing with what were known as midget cars began in the 1940s, but it wasn't until 1956 when Art Ingalls, a veteran race car builder, created the first modern go kart. Early races were held in the parking lot of the Rose Bowl Stadium in California, but it quickly gained popularity and spread all over the world, and it's especially gained a lot of popularity in Europe, but it's popular here as well. And its success can largely be attributed to its relatively low cost of entry and accessibility. For one thing, these cars are a lot cheaper than regular race cars. They're also a lot safer. They're more condensed, so you could pack them more easily. You can move them around fairly easily. They don't guzzle gas nearly as much. Almost anyone can race go karts and have fun. It's not like other racing categories where you have to be a highly trained professional. Although there are sort of professional go karters. Though more often than not, from my understanding, sort of professional go karting is used more so as an entry level step to higher categories of racing, with many famous race car drivers actually getting their start with karts. Not to mention, of course, this sport would inspire its own sort of subgenre in video games, with the kart racing genre popularized by Mario Kart, but would eventually lead to stuff like Crash Team Racing and so on. Actually, there is a go kart track near where I live at a place called Celebration Station. They'll let you for a fee. They'll let you race around in it, and I think I actually did do it once a number of years ago, and it was quite fun. I had a good time with it. Okay. Now, of course, there's also off road racing. In the 1950s and 60s, off road racing really started to take off. This form of racing, as you can probably guess from the name, has people driving off road, but generally there isn't a set track. Rather, they go from checkpoint to checkpoint through rough, unmarked terrain. The most common environment that it's done in is desert, although it can also be done in a number of other places, such as, grassland, mud, stuff like that. And it really started in the deserts of southern California and Mexico. In 1967, the National Off Road Racing Association, or NORA, was formed, and the first official event race was a race across the length of Baja California. Although this isn't, for those of you not familiar with American geography, this isn't California as in the state, but rather the California Peninsula that's part of Mexico. There's also rally racing, which generally with this racers go from point to point along a predetermined route. The races can be either on or off road, and often feature several different types of terrain. Um, I believe that originally rally racing kind of, like a lot of these racing things, kind of started off very amateurish, and I think that that's kind of where the name comes from. Is that people would gather together at these rallies, as they called them, in order to compete with each other. Um, Now, there are cross country rallies that can feature extremely lengthy routes, such as most famously the Dakar Rally, which used to be known as the Paris Dakar Rally, which takes place over 2 weeks and has drivers traveling thousands of kilometers um, through the Arabian Desert. And often, for such long races, the driver will be accompanied by with a navigator, or in some cases an entire crew. So they'll pack like four guys into this one vehicle, and they'll all sort of have a part to play in this. Now, of course, there are other motor vehicles as well, and originally I was gonna do a whole thing about some of these, but as I did research for them, I kind of realized that these other motor vehicles kind of all follow sort of a similar pattern, and their history largely mirrors that of automobile racing, which is to say that in almost every case, immediately after the vehicle in question was invented, people started racing them. After that, various associations were formed, rules were standardized, and indeed, many of the same categories of racing seen in automobiles also apply to other vehicles as well. Um, for example, you have the motorcycle, which was invented in 1885, and I believe that actually, like off road and rally racing, actually kind of started off more as a motorcycle thing, with essentially sort of off road dirt bikes being used originally. Plus, you even in some cases have mixed car and motorcycle races. Like, I believe that in the Dakar Rally, you can be in either a motorcycle or a car. Although I imagine that trying to get through the desert in a motorcycle would be quite a bit more challenging. The first gasoline powered boat was invented in 1886. The first jet ski wasn't invented until 1973, and then of course the first quad bike, or what we may know of as an ATV, or all terrain vehicle, was invented in 1982. So, in conclusion, automobile racing emerged almost as soon as the vehicle in question was invented. And while initially civilian cars were used, over time racing cars became more specialized. Although, again, there are some formats like stock car racing that do kind of try to cling to more. They are specialized to an extent, but they're within the realm of what an average person could potentially build. Um, Over time, different forms of racing were created that emphasized different car builds and different ways to push these machines to their limits. Um, so for example, you have endurance racing, which is designed to test their endurance. You've got time trials, which are designed to test how fast they can go. You've got, drag racing, which is designed to see how fast they can go in a straight line. All stuff like that. Or, different types of terrain, whether it's be on roads versus off-road, or stuff like that. Various associations organized racing events and standardized the rules, and the same thing would end up happening numerous times to other motorsports. But yeah, that is the history of automobile racing, or really motor racing in general, with a focus more so on automobile racing. This is a bit of a shorter unit, so this episode is probably going to be a bit shorter. Yeah, it looks like we only went in for about 40 minutes, so which isn't too bad, but it's going to be a bit shorter than what some of you might be used to. Although the next unit is going to be very long because is going to be quite a bit meatier because next time we're going to be discussing the history of pinball as we inch ever closer to finally talking about video games. Uh, that'll be a fun one to do, and I hope to see you there for that. Hold on, let me switch back. But yeah, I hope you guys found this interesting. If you guys have any questions, now would be a good time to ask them. I'll give you guys a minute. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any takers. That's okay. Um, but yeah, if you're watching this on YouTube, bear in mind that I stream live weekly at 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/Westwind University. I'll be, the videos are, if you didn't catch it live, the videos will be available as VODs. I believe that on Twitch they last for about a week. Plus, then I'll be uploading it to YouTube. I generally try to upload it by around noon or so on Sundays. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it informative and interesting. And I will see you guys next time. Take care.